My name is Gordon Hull. I'm the director of the Ethics Center here at UNC Charlotte, and I'm really excited to start the programming for this, the programming for this year, and the programming for our series on biased AI. Before I introduce today's speaker, Ben Green, I want to take a minute to thank, first of all, the Chancellor's Diversity Challenge Fund, which is a sponsor of this series, and also to plug some of the future events in it. So as I said, today's speaker, Ben Green, is the first. I'm going to attempt to share with you the flyer for the second. This will probably take longer than the information it conveys. So everybody sees Serena Wang will be speaking next on October 28th. She's a PhD student at Berkeley, and she's going to be talking about where we're going with educational technology and AI. So I'd like to invite everyone to make sure you sign up for that. To sign up for any of these events, you can go to the center's webpage, ethics.uncc.edu, or you can use a QR code, which will take you there. So yeah, there we go. So that's Serena on October 28th. Later this semester, we also have Alex Hanna of Google will be giving a talk as well. So watch that space for more speakers. So today's speaker, Ben Green, is a postdoc of Michigan Society of Fellows. He works on sort of, I'd say, pushing the limits of some of our traditional categories, talking about AI and ethics. So, for example, he had a paper about the limits of social good as a framing, paper I really liked, came out a year or two ago, about the limits of procedural and formal accounts of fairness, and then how we can use some kind of mid-20th century legal theory about the way law functions in context to supplement those accounts into something more robust and more challenging. So I don't want to take up any more of his time. So without further ado, here is Ben Green.
Thank you so much, Gordon, for the invitation and setting all of this up. And thanks everyone for coming out. Hopefully this will prove to be a useful and interesting and entertaining use of your lunch hour plus, I suppose. So I'm excited to share some of what I've been thinking about. Most of this talk will sort of go over what some of the more recent work I've been doing around human algorithm interactions and how we think about regulating and making decisions about how to actually put algorithms into practice. We'll go through a talk about all of this, and then we'll have hopefully plenty of time for questions and discussion and all of that. So I want to talk about sort of both broadly the question of algorithmic governance, what it means to implement algorithms into government decision-making in the United States and beyond, but specifically on the role of human oversight and human algorithm interactions. My work broadly looks at how algorithms get implemented into government agencies and tries to bring a variety of perspectives, in particular, expanding beyond the ways that computer science methodologies and epistemologies would sort of approach and analyze these questions to bring in ideas from STS and law and social theory and beyond. So as many of you will surely be familiar, the onset of algorithmic decision-making in government has brought significant debate and controversy. On the one hand, we're often told that these tools have significant promise, such as improving accuracy, fairness, and consistency of decision-making. And yet, on the other hand, we also have seen that these tools have been the source of numerous injustices. Sorry, just moving this around. Have been the source of numerous injustices. With notable instances of mistaken and biased predictions, as well as the idea that making decisions through the rigid rule-based logic of algorithms violates the strongly held principle that government decisions should be responsive to the circumstances of individual people. And so government efforts to adopt algorithms are often met with public skepticism and resistance as communities reject the prospect of inhuman and inflexible automated systems shaping consequential decisions about their lives. I think this sort of banner from a particular protest in Boston that I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment is really interesting. This protest poster of families over algorithms, sort of setting up this tension between different stakeholders or different modes of decision making. And what's notable about when you look at various stories around the effects of harms of algorithms in public policy is that the story expands far beyond how the given tool operates in a purely technical sense. So I'll give a few examples of what I mean by that. In her book, Automating Inequality, Virginia Eubanks describes the implementation of two algorithmic systems in California and Pennsylvania, one to address homelessness and another to address child abuse. Both systems were intended to improve social welfare and appeared in a technical sense to be capable of doing so. Yet because of how these algorithms interacted with existing social inequalities and oppressive public policies, the algorithms ended up criminalizing poverty, enhancing surveillance, and increasing the vulnerability of the very people who were intended to benefit from the tool. Another example comes from Boston, where several years ago, the public schools worked with researchers at MIT to develop an algorithm to improve the scheduling of bus routes. Although the algorithm appeared capable of improving a variety of outcomes, such as the cost of busing students and the appropriate age or the age-appropriate start times of schools, the algorithm's implementation received significant pushback, in part because of how the proposed shifts would have affected the day-to-day lives of families. It would have required notable shifts in parents' work schedules. Many would have had to quit or find new jobs, and would have hit low-income and non-white families particularly hard. And finally, there's the story of the Chicago Strategic Subjects List, which was an effort intended, at least in theory, to reduce gun violence through preventative interventions. Rather than reducing violence, however, being placed on the list, it resulted in an increased chance of being arrested that was unrelated to any actual difference in outcomes. This happened because some officers used the list in an unintended manner as individuals who should be leads or suspects in shooting cases. So what's notable about all three of these examples is that the harms here are not obviously connected to clear instances of so-called bad engineering. And instead, these issues arose when the algorithms interacted with public policy, social contexts, and human decision makers to produce unexpected harms. One of the central failings of algorithmic systems when applied to government is that much of computer science relies on a flawed methodology, a methodology that works in many cases quite remarkably well when dealing with theoretical algorithmic challenges, but become flawed when it comes to developing systems that can be applied in government. So I describe this mode of reasoning as algorithmic formalism, and have a paper sort of going into depth into what algorithmic formalism is and what an alternative approach might look like. At a high level, we can see that algorithmic formalism rests on the idea that the full logic of mathematical reasoning can fully define a problem. So if we look, for instance, at one of the more popular algorithm design textbooks that's taught to advanced undergraduates or graduate students in computer science, we can see these ideas where algorithmic ideas form the language that lets you cleanly express the underlying questions. And a clean algorithmic definition can formalize a notion that seems too fuzzy and non-intuitive to work with mathematically. So this, as I said, has enabled algorithms and computer science to achieve some pretty remarkable outcomes, but it also overlooks a number of factors that become pretty central when you're applying these systems of government. These include human algorithm interactions, the social political context in which these tools are being embedded, theories of social change and reform, questions of governance and democracy and infrastructure. And so when combined with other issues, such as government institutions that adopt algorithms without sufficiently scrutinizing the quality of these tools, this approach of algorithmic formalism leads to the implementation of systems that have unexpected unjust impacts, as well as regulatory approaches that fail to fully account for how algorithms actually impact policy outcomes. And what I want to focus on here is this, for the rest of this talk, is this question of human algorithm interactions and the role that that plays both in affecting the outcomes of algorithms, but also in raising a central question of how we should actually govern these tools. Now, typically, when we think about algorithm development, we often will analyze algorithms as if they are the final decision maker. We look at the accuracy of these tools and we look at their fairness, sort of treating the algorithm as the decision maker in and of itself. And sometimes, and increasingly, public policy will often say, we sort of want a human overseeing the algorithm. In other words, we want a human in the loop of this system, and sort of takes for granted that the role of the human is sort of there in the background and can oversee this algorithmic decision maker. But this fails to really capture what's actually going on in these systems. What we really have are humans who make decisions, and we are integrating algorithms as tools of advice or feedback into these human decision-making processes, creating what I call an algorithm in the loop system. And so rather than treating the algorithm as independent technical systems or treating the human as sort of this simple add-on to the algorithm, we need to analyze this algorithm in the loop process as part of a broader socio-technical system. And so for the rest of the talk, I want to focus on the limits of this human in the loop approach, particularly related to our attempts to regulate the use of algorithms in government decision-making. So in the face of concerns about the unjust effects of algorithms, many regulators have turned to human oversight as one of these central tools for ensuring the legitimacy and safety of these tools. Essentially, human oversight policies enable governments to use algorithms, even given some known flaws in those systems, as long as a human decision maker has some form of oversight over the final decision. To many policymakers, human oversight seems to alleviate the risks of algorithms in high stakes contexts like government. The European Commission released a proposed AI Act back in April. And in this act, they write that for high risk AI systems, human oversight is strictly necessary to mitigate the risks to fundamental rights and safety posed by AI. Essentially, we know that these harms can arise, harms of bias and eliminating due process. And so it's necessary to have human oversight in the mix. And when human oversight is in the mix, it makes government use of algorithms permissible according to many policies. The Canadian Directive on Automated Decision-Making notes that decisions that are likely to have high or very high social impacts cannot be made without having specific human intervention points during the decision-making process, and the final decision must be made by a human. In theory, adopting algorithms while ensuring human oversight could enable governments to obtain the best of both worlds. The accuracy or the supposed accuracy, objectivity, and consistency of algorithmic decision-making paired with the individualized and contextual discretion of human decision-making, additionally with humans able to correct for the errors and biases that can creep into algorithmic systems. So when we look at public policies today, most of which have been passed or proposed just over the last 3 to 5 years, we can see 3 broad approaches to mandating human oversight. The first approach is to place restrictions on so-called solely automated decisions. The most notable example here would be the GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation, which is largely a privacy bill, but does contain some significant articles related to automated profiling. So in these settings, it prohibits solely automated decisions for certain types of decisions. And then where allowed, the subjects have certain rights, such as the right to notification about that decision and the right to human intervention, or the right to have a human review the decision that was made solely by an algorithm. The second approach is to require human discretion in decisions that involve algorithmic advice. For these settings, governments may use algorithms as long as a human decision maker has discretion to override the algorithm and make the final decision. An example of this would be the Canadian directive that I showed on the previous slide, as well as here we see this is really the approach taken for many of the most high stakes and controversial systems that have been implemented in recent years, such as the Compass risk assessment used in the criminal justice system and the Allegheny family screening tool used in the child welfare system in Allegheny County, which is the county that surrounds Pittsburgh. So in these settings, what we have courts and policymakers saying is that it's appropriate to use these risk assessments in pretrial and sentencing and beyond, as long as a human has the final decision-making authority. And finally, the third approach requires that there must be meaningful human input. And this approach sort of extends on or builds on the second approach, noting that some forms of human oversight can be relatively superficial or flawed, and so emphasizes this idea that human input must be meaningful. This was the approach taken by the EU's AI Act, which is poised to become, I think, in much of the same way that the GDPR is for privacy, potentially a sort of global trendsetter for AI policy. Another example is a Washington state bill that concerns facial recognition, noting that law enforcement can use facial recognition tools as long as the decisions that follow are subject to meaningful human review. So all of these raise an important question of, do human oversight policies actually work? They're sort of all taking for granted this idea that we can insert a human into this decision-making loop, and that human will cover up for whatever issues we might be concerned about that would arise if the algorithm were operating autonomously. So it's essential to ensure that these policies actually provide the desired protections, taking a more socio-technical and algorithm in the loop approach to really look at what happens when we have humans and algorithms interacting and collaborating to make decisions. Because if these policies don't work, they can have the perverse effect of alleviating scrutiny of government algorithms without actually addressing the underlying concerns. And this is effectively the situation that I think we find ourselves in. I argue that these human oversight policies suffer from two quite fundamental flaws. The first flaw is that these policies have a meager basis in empirical evidence. So I'm going to run through all three of the types of human oversight that I described earlier and walk through why each type falls short, and in particular, why there's little evidence to suggest that these mechanisms of oversight actually alleviate the broader concerns with algorithmic decision-making. So the first approach was to restrict solely automated decisions. And the problem here is that these policies like the GDPR provide what I think is quite superficial protection. First, they have a rather limited scope, because when you draw this boundary around solely automated decisions, such that those are the only type of decisions that have protections associated with them, you lose any ability to regulate decisions that actually do involve human interactions. And so when we look at tools that are used in the criminal justice system, in education, in child welfare, those tools already have human involvement. And so these types of regulations would not actually apply to many of the most controversial and harmful systems. And they also create a relative loophole where relatively nominal and superficial forms of human involvement can qualify a decision as no longer being solely automated. So because there's this sort of binary approach where certain types of algorithms would be regulated, and as long as there's human involvement, there's no regulation, there's sort of this incentive to provide just enough human involvement so that you can actually avoid potentially all of these regulations. And even the right of someone who was a subject of one of these decisions to receive post hoc human intervention is of rather limited benefit. Procedurally, it puts the onus on individuals after they've already suffered harm So even if they are able to request review, many will either not have the means or the knowledge to do that, and they will still have to undergo a long process before any remedy might actually be provided. And then substantively, this type of human review is unlikely to produce better decisions. And I'll describe why as we sort of move into this next form of human oversight. Because even when human oversight moves beyond superficial rubber stamp approaches, such that people are actually granted agency to use discretion and make final decisions, human oversight is unlikely to provide protections against the harms of algorithmic decision-making. There's evidence going back several decades at this point that across many domains, automated decision support systems tend to alter human decision-making in unexpected and detrimental ways. The most notable example of this is automation bias, through which people will defer to the advice of automated systems, even though they, without giving a sufficient scrutiny to what's actually going on and evaluating the situation, even when they could potentially quite clearly recognize that the automated system is giving incorrect guidance. And more recent evidence shows that people are bad at judging the quality of algorithmic outputs and determining when to override those outputs. For instance, people's judgments about when and how to diverge from algorithmic recommendations are often incorrect and biased. So this is a pretty fundamental issue with these human discretion policies, because when you look at the policies and court rulings, one of the central things that they say is that the human can diverge and override, the human can override the algorithm such that they can correct for erroneous or biased predictions. Yet almost all available evidence shows that people are actually quite bad at doing that, at determining when to override algorithms and how they might do that. And we can see examples of this in the criminal justice system and in policing, where many examples show police officers inappropriately deferring to algorithms, such as facial recognition algorithms, even when there are clear flaws in the outputs. And in contrast, judges in the United States regularly deviate from algorithmic advice, but typically in ways that increase incarceration and racial disparities rather than decreasing those outcomes. And then finally, even when we turn to so-called meaningful human oversight, we also don't see improvements in outcomes from this form of human oversight. So first, it's worth noting that there's a bit of a definitional challenge here, where no policy actually provides a clear definition of what meaningful human oversight entails. And on the one hand, that might be okay because, many policies, there are many standards that we have in law and policy that can depend on context and don't have a sort of precise rule-like definition. But what we really need to have is some standard, and then more importantly, some evidence that the central components that might go into that standard actually improve outcomes. And in the absence of those mechanisms, proposals for meaningful human oversight will merely sound reassuring without actually providing any benefits. And this is the situation that we see when we analyze these calls for meaningful oversight. We can look at, there are three components that are described as central to meaningful human oversight. The first is that people should be able to override the algorithm. Here we see overlap with the previous approach, but as described, people typically override algorithms in detrimental ways. The second component is that people should be able to understand the algorithm through mechanisms such as explanations and transparency. But evidence shows that these mechanisms do not actually improve human oversight. And in fact, they can prompt people to place more inappropriate trust into these tools, even when they are flawed. And then finally, the last goal of meaningful oversight is that people should avoid relying too heavily on algorithms. Yet evidence shows that people typically defer to automated tools and increase their attention to the factors emphasized by algorithms. So for instance, when people are shown a risk assessment tool, they actually they alter how they factor in risk into their decision-making process, becoming more risk averse in terms of how they're even making decisions when they are shown the algorithm's advice without actually recognizing that they're changing their decision-making process in this manner. So what we have is a bunch of policies that call for various types of human oversight as a form of regulation that can protect against the harms of incorrect and biased and inflexible algorithms. But all evidence suggests that these policies don't actually work. They don't provide the types of benefits that are expected and that motivate these policies. And so then this leads to a second flaw, which is that what the ultimate effect of these policies is that they legitimate flawed and unaccountable algorithms in government. And there are really two dimensions to this second issue. The first is that human oversight provides a false sense of security in adopting algorithms. Human oversight policies cover up these fundamental concerns that publics and scholars and even government officials have about the use of algorithms in government decision-making. And in many cases, these concerns undercut the very reasoning for adopting algorithms in government. Yet rather than turning to questioning or simply rejecting the use of these tools, policymakers present human oversight as the salve that enables governments to obtain the benefits of these tools without incurring the associated harms. One example of this comes in the case, the court case in the Supreme Court of Wisconsin, where they analyzed whether it was appropriate to look at a risk assessment or the COMPAS risk assessment when making sentencing decisions. What the court decided was that it was acceptable, writing that consideration of COMPAS is permissible, reliance on COMPAS for the sentence imposed is not permissible. Just as correction staff should disregard risk scores that are inconsistent with other factors, we expect that circuit courts will exercise discretion when assessing a COMPAS risk score with respect to each individual defendant. So what we see in these policies or in this ruling is that what Wisconsin Supreme Court is acknowledging, and they explicitly acknowledge the potential for errors and biases in these tools, but they say that as long as the tool is merely a piece of advice and that judges use discretion, it's perfectly acceptable to use this tool. So in other words, we see human oversight making it seem legitimate for governments to use algorithms, but it fails to address the underlying concerns about inaccurate and biased predictions because remember, judges are actually not capable, as all evidence suggests, of providing the types of scrutiny that would be desired for these types of discretion, right? To be able to note or to be able to identify which predictions are inaccurate or biased and improve the outcomes by overriding those decisions, but not overriding others. And then in turn, human oversight policies shift responsibility for algorithmic systems away from agency leaders and technology vendors towards human operators, because the emphasis is really placed on the human operator providing oversight as the key form of protection. And so this approach allows vendors and governments to have it both ways. When things go well, they can give the algorithm credit, but when things go badly, they can blame the human operators for failing to do their job. An example here comes in the place of, many of you might have seen the news story that broke a little over a year ago at this point about a man in Detroit who was arrested because of a false match from a facial recognition system used by the Detroit Police Department. Earlier this year, sometime I think over the summer, the Detroit police chief went on 60 Minutes and had this conversation. Anderson Cooper asked what happened in the case of Robert Williams, that's the man who was arrested, what went wrong? And the Detroit police chief responds, sloppy investigative work. That detective was disciplined. And subsequently, a commanding officer of that command has been de-appointed. But it wasn't facial recognition that failed. What failed was a horrible investigation. So what we see here is an example where the promise of human oversight positions frontline human operators as the scapegoats for these systems, even though the harms of these systems have been structured by more powerful institutional actors. When we think about what happened in the case of this arrest, sure, perhaps the human operators could have been able to notice that Robert Williams was not the man in the photo that they were, feeding into the facial recognition system. But ultimately, this is a harm that was structured by the use of a facial recognition tool that was not well tested, when we know that there's lots of evidence that facial recognition is significantly flawed, that it's particularly flawed with respect to identifying African Americans, and as well that facial recognition broadly, as many legal scholars and activists and others have noted, presents a severe violation of civil liberties and fundamental rights. And so to place the blame on the human operator and to say that we're punished, that the detective and the officer have been punished, is to sort of obfuscate all of these other decisions, many of which made by the Detroit police chief himself, in terms of the decision to actually implement a tool like this into police operations. So the question then becomes, what's the alternative, right? If we can't simply rely on human oversight as a mechanism for protecting against the harms of government algorithms, what can we do? What can we do? To be clear, the answer is not at all to say, well, human oversight doesn't work. Let's just get rid of the human and allow these algorithms to operate autonomously. Instead, we need to rethink sort of what our approach is at all. In many cases, if we're uncomfortable with an algorithm unless there's human oversight, if the human oversight doesn't work, then we really should be less comfortable with those algorithms at all, even with human oversight. So we need to rethink an alternative strategy for determining whether and in what form to incorporate algorithms into government decision-making at all, rather than allowing human oversight to provide a gloss over those fundamental decisions of which tools are even in place, at the outset. So I think what I propose is sort of a two-stage approach to thinking about this, where we really need to increase the burden placed on primarily agencies, but also often on technology vendors, to proactively demonstrate first that it's actually appropriate to deploy an algorithm for a given decision, and second, that any proposed human oversight or human algorithm collaborations actually have some base of empirical support and are likely to improve the outcomes. So the first stage here involves, evaluating whether a given algorithm is suitable for a proposed decision, addressing that second flaw of human oversight policies, where these policies tend to legitimize the use of algorithms when there are many flaws suggesting that really these algorithms shouldn't actually be used in the first place. So we can see there are three primary components here. The first is the idea of red lines, that many applications of algorithms simply violate fundamental notions of justice and human rights and should be prohibited. Facial recognition is one example of a tool where many scholars and activists and others are suggesting, and I would agree, that this is a technology that just should not exist. There's no level of accuracy or oversight that will make this type of technology beneficial for a democratic society. And then the other two dimensions get into questions of what is the appropriate role for an algorithm in decisions. The more that a decision requires individualized human discretion, the less appropriate it generally is for algorithms to influence decision-making. And then in terms of the algorithm, the more that an algorithm is trustworthy in terms of its accuracy, in terms of its ability or the extent to which it has been rigorously tested and evaluated and so on, the more appropriate it is for that algorithm to influence decisions. And so all of these considerations involve political judgments and must be evaluated democratically. And one approach here is to really increase the burden on an agency that's proposing to adopt an algorithm to justify, according to these three components, and there could be additional dimensions to this, why it's actually appropriate for them to adopt this tool, why they think the tool is trustworthy, and why it's likely to improve outcomes. And that sort of mechanism can help to center broader political debate about whether the algorithm is actually suitable, and help to shift responsibility and accountability towards these upstream structural decision-making processes, and not just let it all fall on the human operators. And then the second stage is to, where we have an instance where there's a situation where we think this algorithm is reasonable to implement, and we want to do that with some form of human oversight or human algorithm collaboration, we then should be turning to rigorous evaluations of how these collaborations actually operate in practice. So rather than just assuming that we can throw the human into the loop and they will correct all of the issues, we need to increase the burden on agencies and vendors to affirmatively demonstrate beforehand that people can effectively oversee an algorithm, such that an algorithm should only be adopted in a form where there will be human collaborations, if there's actually evidence that those collaborations can operate as desired and can improve outcomes rather than leading to unexpected bad consequences. And then even once the tool is adopted in practice, we should be subjecting the algorithm to ongoing, or the human uses of the system to ongoing monitoring. So this represents an expansion where a lot of recent regulation and advocacy points to the need for greater assessments of how these tools operate. Regulations, highlight the need to test the accuracy and the fairness of these tools, often beforehand, both before and after implementation. And I think that we need to extend those to be also considering, how do humans interact with these tools? What happens in the broader decision-making process? And so by taking this more socio-technical and evidence-based approach, policymakers will facilitate more democratic and equitable decisions regarding how governments use algorithms. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm excited for questions and discussion.
Great, thank you so much for that. I think so. We have, I hope, a small enough group that we can sort of self-moderate. So I will encourage people to either raise their hands or unmute when it's quiet. And I see that Lisa has her hand up, so I will just defer to her.
Hi, Ben. Thanks so much. That was great, and gave me a lot of things to think about. I come from the world of research ethics, and so when I think of human oversight, I think about it in maybe some different ways. So I have a quick clarifying question first, and then a follow-up. So the clarifying question is, when people talk about human oversight, of what, or what should they be overseeing? Is it individual harms? Is it societal outcomes? Is it algorithmic outputs? What exactly are they proposing, or is it vary? Because it seems like the solution will vary accordingly depending on what you're trying to do, but I have some specific questions sort of beyond that.
Yeah. So human oversight, so the way that it's normally that, these policies focus it is really on the sort of specific moment of decision making, right? So you have, a judge is determining how to sentence a defendant, and as they are making that decision, they have the output from a specific algorithm about that individual person. So, we're not, and that's sort of like that moment of decision making is where these policies focus in this respect of human oversight. And so, it's not, and so both the analysis and the critique of human oversight is not really about, there are obviously broader forms of societal oversight or human oversight that we, have been implemented, whether that's a task force or a regulatory agency. There are lots of things that could be called human oversight of algorithms. And sort of the human in the loop model is, we're looking at the specific moment of decision making.
Okay, so it's neither post hoc nor prior restraint. models.
Right.
So then I guess my question is, if you say that humans are supposed to be a corrective on AI, that doesn't yet tell you what they're supposed to do to be corrective. So for example, if we locate the benefit of human oversight in the right to face an accuser, that looks one way, right? But if we're trying to gather information from multiple people, it looks more like an IRB or something where the idea is you crowdsource to try and avoid some bias by drawing on multiple perspectives. And that those seem to, excuse me, to be to point in different directions for the solution and the problem, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there are a couple of different sort of motivations for inserting the human oversight. I mean, I think I'd sort of break it down into two main types. The first would be sort of quality control, that we know that these tools can be flawed, and so we want a human to identify errors, identify biases, and correct for those issues. And then the second main category would be some form of discretion and due process, that a decision should be made by a human who can account for the individual, circumstances of an individual and incorporate the algorithm into that, rather than being sort of purely automated and treating that, not treating that person as an individual, say. So those are really the two different dimensions. And to me, those actually are quite similar. Some people would think of those as quite more distinct in terms of being more, sort of consequentialist on the one hand and dignitarian on the other. I sort of think of those as quite interlinked in this context. But yeah, that's really the sense of motivation.
Thank you.
Yeah. It looks like Bojan. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing.
No, that's okay. Thank you. Thank you for the good presentation. I come from the computing side, and I'll clearly play the bad guy in questioning. But just for the disclosure, I did direct an NSF Center on Identification Technology for 5-6 years, and I'm quite familiar with all the limitations of biometrics and similar identification technologies. But in my mind, when you are talking about banning a technology because of a certain proportion of decisions which violate fairness principles, my question really is, what are we falling back to? We know that human identification lacks automated identification. I mean, there are studies, empirical studies that are pretty strong, that are showing that accuracy of automated identification in face is higher than human identification. So we know that in the court system, the witnesses are not to be trusted with face recognition, because generally as humans, we recognize best our friends and family, a group of about 50 people, and we are not good at all recognizing others. We entrust the operation of nuclear power plants and their shutdown systems to automated systems to which you cannot prove trustworthiness to more than 1 in 1,000, which means that if you have 1,000 cases where nuclear power plants need shutdown because of possible catastrophic consequences, you are running the case that system is not going to make the right decision. Yet, that we run those systems. We accept the trustworthiness based on the scientific evidence that we can provide, right? So I'm just trying to argue or ask your opinion whether such a position that we should ban technology. In my opinion, it's not the black and white. It's a case-by-case study. We should ban certain uses of technology, not necessarily technology. I just want to hear your.
Yeah, I think thanks for the comment. I mean, I think that I would agree with a lot of that. I think that for me, that sort of first stage that I was describing is really about is exactly about recognizing that it's not black and white and that the answer depends on these various dimensions. So, certain applications, certain types of technologies we might want to ban, but that's not meant to say that the ultimate outcome is to say that government should never use algorithms. And then the question really becomes, what sorts of decision are we integrating these into? Because certainly, if there's a relatively straightforward prediction decision, for instance, if we're thinking about machine learning systems, and there's a situation where we have humans making predictions and we have an algorithm that can make that prediction more accurately, that very well may be in a place where it's appropriate to have the algorithm operate and to have the algorithm, maybe even operate autonomously. But the challenge is that many of the cases where algorithms have been implemented are not straightforward prediction problems. They're actually these much more complex decision-making problems where the predictive component needs to be balanced with other dimensions about due process and civil liberties and freedom, and it depends on the case. And so even if, I've done some of my other recent work has shown that in those types of settings, even if the algorithm can improve the accuracy of the human predictions of the predictive component of that decision, they don't actually improve the final decision in the ways that you would expect because they alter the decision-making process. And so the challenge really comes up in, a lot of these policy decisions are just quite complex. And so the integration of the algorithm, the effects of that can be hard to sort of predict ahead of time. And so that's where I think understanding these dimensions of what type of decision is it, and then really looking at the human algorithm interaction component. And I think there's both, in addition to that sort of pre-deployment evaluation that I was talking about, there's also a really central role for computer scientists here in helping to develop a better scientific understanding of these types of interactions, looking for other mechanisms that can improve these collaborations. I mean, 3 or 5 years ago, you had lots of computer scientists excited about explanations. Now we have evidence, the studies that have been done suggest that those don't help humans provide quality control in the way that we thought, but there's lots of other things to try. And so it's sort of a, multiple fronts of better analyzing, is this algorithm actually appropriate, as well as really thinking about pushing the boundary on the research side around, can we improve these collaborations, or can we at least understand the parameters of, where people are reliably going to fail, and here's how we can account for that. To be able to make more informed decisions, because otherwise we end up in a situation where we, many of these tools have been deployed and the actual outcome is totally different than what we were expecting or what policymakers were expecting, because humans are not using it in the way that was sort of intended by the policymakers, because they didn't really think about that full process.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I see, let's see, Doug, I think is at the top of the queue.
Thanks, appreciate it. So yeah, I like your presentation and the control mechanisms that we're starting to go through. And I came out of an industry where there was something called model risk management, which actually implements, I don't know if you've heard of that before or not, but implements many of the things that you're talking about. But just wondering, as they've learned their lessons about, because they do the pre-launch analysis and basically challenge, and then the post-launch and monitoring before and after a human decision, right? You have to monitor the model decisions because they always degrade over time. But you also have to model the decisions after, which is where many people forget to actually monitor it after. Is that what you're thinking about and advocating for? And is there an opportunity to use this framework that's probably been undergoing improvement for 10 years now to be able to do that? Is that what you're thinking, but I mean, because the justice system, the government's more complex than where I came from, right? The system and societal impacts, but it's also fairly complex where I came from. So any thoughts on how to do this and how to get the adoption, right? Because there is a practice, and how do you get it adopted to be able to do that? Because it costs money to monitor.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I'm not familiar with that framework, but there's a lot as we think about developing more robust regulation and practices in these contexts with these technologies. I think there's a lot to learn by looking at other types of ways that technologies have been adopted in various, complex settings, from the settings you were operating in, and there's medicine, and there's aviation and autopilot, and these there's lots of broader lessons about what it means to implement technology and tools of automation into human and organizational decision-making processes. So I think there is a lot to be gained by looking at that. I mean, certainly, I think, one of the real challenges here is in terms of sort of institutional will and resources, because these sorts of evaluations do require more work. And I think right now when it comes to these types of algorithms in government, there's a sort of shockingly low level of scrutiny placed on these tools and placed on the governance mechanisms, which is how we, one of the main reasons we get to a lot of these systems that we have today. And so I think, I think there is a central role for, increasing the burden on these tools. And yes, that will make it more intensive, but I think will also provide the necessary check on just sort of adopting tools because it's easier, because the company came to you with a sweet deal promising they can save you money and things like that. So I think, we have to, in the same way that, we regulate, we put resources into regulating medicine and food, I think we need those sorts of, investments in the underlying sort of monitoring of these tools too.
Yep. And it gets down to, what are you comparing against to Boyan, is what does society expect? Do we expect to be able to be better than human decision making? Or are you going to hold the combined system to a higher standard? So anyway, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So I think I see, let's see, Robin, and then Min, and then Nathan.
Hi, Ben.
And then
Thanks
Gordon.
so much for your talk. So I really appreciated kind of in the middle when you talked about how human oversight policies tend to scapegoat individual users and naturalize or obscure systemic issues, right? So to give you a sense of kind of where I'm coming from with this, like back ages ago, I took actual graduate classes in critical race theory. So I'm just wondering what you would say in the cases of something like the criminal justice system or the child welfare system, which are sort of widely known to be extremely racist, right? That we should not use algorithms at all until we can demonstrate that basically the racism issues in these institutions have been fixed or significantly ameliorated. Because it seems like the way algorithms function is to just kind of amplify the already racist human judgments that operate in courts or amongst social workers or things like that. So yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, no, thanks, Robin, for the question. And I would say, yeah, I completely agree that I think in a lot of these cases, right, the answer is not to use the tool. And I think this also gets at sort of why I'm nervous of falling back, at least at first, on the sort of how does the algorithm compare to the human? Because we can be striving for something better than what the human is doing right now without simply replacing that decision with an algorithm. And so because often, and this didn't get into it so much, but often these algorithms are presented as tools of reform that are supposed to be improving outcomes and making these systems more fair. And as you said, they're not, they're really just reinstantiating the types of decisions that are already being made. And so, the answer is not, in my mind, when we have a lot of these systems, is not to say, abandon the system and just leave it with the also flawed and biased human, but there are other reforms that we can make that are actually going to be far more effective. And even other roles that algorithms might be able to play in that process, that's just different than, replacing one type of decision or sort of just optimizing one very specific decision point. And I think that approach is where a lot of the work on algorithmic reforms and algorithmic fairness goes wrong, is because we take the lens that reform and change means just operating at the sort of focal point of a very specific decision-making process and not being able to account for those other questions of systemic issues and other pathways of reform. So
Thanks.
yeah, thanks for raising that. Min?
Thank you, Ben, for the great talk. And it seems that I think we have finally moved beyond just identifying the problem now to actually suggesting concrete steps to be taken to address the problems. Really appreciate your talk. It's really interesting that yesterday we learned about what happened to Facebook and they're the whistleblower. And it seems like we have the tools and the necessary technical, I think, tools to implement changes. It's the incentives that are stacked against implementing meaningful changes. Facebook know all along that they need to make changes. They know that their platforms are making suicidal rates even higher among teenagers, that they have internal documents, internal studies, but they're not doing anything about it, because actually getting the teenagers even more hooked up to this system is really good for their profit, for their bottom line. So I wonder what suggestions, I mean, you are recommending concrete steps to be taken to address, sort of the technical component of this. And I wonder how that could be or needs to be actually aligned with the fundamental incentives, economic structures. Because yes, we can recommend everything that is doable and wonderful, but they're not going to be implemented if Facebook is not going to do it, right? Facebook has its own oversight board. It's not doing very much. I mean, the oversight board can, recommend maybe 10 things, 10 cases. How is that going to be ramped up to a systematic level, as Robin was suggesting, as Lisa was suggesting? They're not. And so I wonder, what needs to be done with regard to that. And there's a lot of literature on algorithmic auditing. So I don't know if, like we have cars that are getting consumer reports, right? I mean, in terms of their safety and quality. Can we do the same thing about algorithms as well on an ongoing basis, not just like as you recommended in some instances, but systematic evaluation of their safety and quality? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Min, for the question. There's a lot of really important dimensions here, and I think everything with respect to Facebook. I mean, I think that when we think about the sort of more on the private sector side, I think this Facebook example sort of really highlights why I'm generally skeptical of a lot of the sort of tech ethics world that has spun up around a lot of these topics, which tend to focus on the design of these tools and those dimensions, while sort of leaving to the side the broader questions of business models and business incentives. And I think that much of those same issues are absolutely in place when it comes to government. I mean, a lot of the reason these tools or sort of these decisions are operating in a backdrop of austerity, where, and sort of like a neoliberal inclination towards public-private partnerships, where there is this desire to save money and to work with companies and to be seen as innovative and to sort of try to cut costs and make things more efficient in that form. And so I think, yes, and then you sort of have these technology companies that are, incredibly well resourced, the most, richer than many nations, the richest companies in the world, that have just a level of resources that is so far outweighs what the government's agencies who are making these decisions often have at their disposal. And so there's these real imbalances that lead to a lot of these decisions to shape these tools. And you certainly have the sort of broader policies in the US oriented towards sort of a pretty racist surveillance and carceral state that has also made a lot of these tools and a lot of the worst instances of the sort of most poorly evaluated tools are in, police surveillance and criminal justice and essentially kicking people off of welfare and all of that. And so I think we can't separate sort of our interests in what we would do with an algorithm from the broader political questions. And I think, I've been encouraged by a lot of the organizing that's been happening in recent years, and a lot of mostly at sort of the local city level, some at the state, where we've seen, the bans of facial recognition in many cities. We've seen in some cases, bans on predictive policing algorithms or much more significant scrutiny and reporting on various types of surveillance technology. And I think that some of those types of mechanisms could be an interesting, like I talk about with surveillance oversight ordinances. I think there's a good model for some of the types of burden shifting that we'd want to put on agencies with respect to algorithms, and just providing those sorts of democratic processes, democratic accountability that is necessary. But I think, the sort of reform efforts need to be linked up. We can't think about it as an algorithm operating in isolation, but really there's a broader effort to improve these systems, to improve these political economies. And there's, in many cases, the algorithm is playing really negative roles. There might be cases where the algorithm can play productive roles, but we have to start from that broader theory of change and not from sort of, here's what the algorithm can do. And I think that, and sort of similarly in response to Robin's question, I think where a lot of the efforts at algorithm reform go wrong is because they fail to start from that larger perspective of what are the types of changes that would be useful in this system and what algorithm, if any algorithm, would be appropriate here.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Nathan and Gordon, you're up.
Yeah, I also want to echo everyone else's comment, and I really enjoyed your presentation. So thank you for that. You kind of touched on my question a little bit at the end there when talking about the reforms that we're going to be advocating here. And part of I kept wondering, is the issue of the involvement with the kind of meaningful involvement of human decision making, is it an issue of training? Like these people just aren't really properly trained to actually catch systemic racist algorithmic policies or oppression of certain minority groups, or the kind of misuse of the algorithm? Are they just not properly trained? And this is kind of like, well, this is a new kind of area, so it's going to take a little bit of time to kind of really get clear about how to do this well. Or are you making the claim that this is a really problematic feature in principle? Like we should just not really do this. We need to go to a different direction. We need to look at institutional change, functional economic change, legal change. Like we need to go a different direction and kind of just get off this model of having quote unquote meaningful human involvement. Or is it really about, well, here's how we need to kind of work the training better?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's a little bit of both and somewhat open to further empirical investigation. I mean, I wish the answer were as simple as these people just aren't trained well, right? I think like there's not, I think there's more to be done to study like at what point can we train people, and are there things that we can do, whether it's training, for instance, that can improve this. But I don't think it's as simple as just giving them better training, because I think that there's sort of a fundamental, I think, and sort of to this point of like, maybe we need other ways of thinking about this, because there's sort of this circularity to a lot of this logic, because we have, we say we don't trust humans because they're flawed in these ways. So we want to have an algorithm, but then we say the algorithm is also flawed in these ways. So we're going to have that be corrected by the human who's being corrected by the algorithm. So we sort of have this circular logic that I think reflects a lack of really thinking fully about how do we want these decisions to get made? Are there other ways of actually either providing advice, maybe moving to more of a decision support model that's not so in the sort of like replacing the human decision model, I think has some promise. Other ways of structuring, there's other ways that even in the law that have nothing to do with algorithms that we structure sort of the more rule-like and the more standard-like components of a decision. And we could look at ways of doing that, other forms of integrating. So I think that in many cases, there probably is some improvement that we can achieve of human oversight with further research. But I also think that model, I think part of the reason it's so flawed is because it just doesn't really work as a model, and because it reflects a lack of really working through the tensions and issues that arise in all forms of legal decision making between the sort of like rigid rule-like desire that we have in some senses and the more standardized discretionary decisions that we have in other. And that's, if you read about street level bureaucracies, that's sort of this central paradox in these decisions. And so, but we have to really grapple with that in a way that I think the human oversight model fails to do. Yeah, thank you. Gordon, back to you.
Yeah, thanks for the paper. So this is, you mentioned the sort of neoliberal context of agency policy, and this is, I suppose, about that. So agencies are going to make their decisions based on a sort of very particular efficiency-driven model of cost-benefit analysis, right? And I wonder if that doesn't stack the deck in really strange ways, because it's going to be, I mean, if you think about, there's this discussion over at Law and Political Economy blog about this, and the way that, cost-benefit analysis turns out to be political and skewed away from, say, negative externalities. So Frank Pasquale talks about environmental regulation, where it's like somehow we can't look at vague environmental benefits. We can look at harms to business models and that sort of thing. And so I think a tech company is always going to be able to say, well, we'll be more efficient, right? We can save you money for cops on the street. We can automate this process. And so I wonder if one of the implications of what you said is we don't need some change in how regulatory agencies make decisions about adopting policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks for the connection to the sort of cost benefit analysis. I've seen those posts on the blog and have not read them yet, but I think that's right, and I think echoes a lot of what we see with respect to algorithms, where it's very easy to talk about increasing efficiency, and with respect to machine learning to talk about increasing accuracy. And I think that's one of the central things we see in these sorts of settings, where it's very easy to show that an algorithm makes more accurate predictions than a human. And I mean, that is often going to be the case. Algorithms are better at that than people are in most instances. And so like, great, we can show that. But that in most cases is not telling the full story, but it's often much harder to evaluate those other components of how a decision gets made and what other values need to be balanced with the desire for accuracy, which is in most cases just one of multiple interests. And so so I don't have sort of a great answer to it, but I think that the challenges arise in very much the same manner. And I think that can be, if done well, that can be a role of regulation, or sort of putting various types of burdens that an agency might have to go through to say, you have to justify this in terms of more than just the accuracy of the tool, right? And I think, and even most of the regulations that have been proposed fail to do that. They really just look at requiring, various types of impact assessments that look at the sort of very technical evaluations of the tool's accuracy. And maybe with some notion of like, doesn't violate fundamental rights. But I think just forcing them to have a process that is more expanded and accounts for more of these dimensions. And, I'm sure there are other ways of doing this that I'm not familiar with or aware of, but that seems like what needs to be the ultimate goal, is to force them to do that and to have those decisions be subject to some form of democratic discussion and accountability as well, because if you allow certain agencies to make those decisions about whether it's good for, democracy, they'll just decide that it is, even if everyone doesn't want it. So, it needs to also be subject to more of that open discussion.
All right, are there other questions? We're sort of winding up on our time here, but we definitely have time for one more if anybody has one. Okay, well, if people are done thinking for the lunch hour, then we should just say thank you to Ben. It's a great talk. I'm really glad you're able to join us, and thank everybody for being here and for your questions. And to remind you that you can come hear Serena Wang talk on October 28th about education technology and algorithms. So I want to make sure that invitation is extended to everyone.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Gordon. Thanks everyone for the really thoughtful questions and your time. I really enjoyed the discussion, and looking forward to future interactions and conversations. Take care, everyone.
Okay, thanks. Bye.